Thank you very much, Zakia, for the keynote presentations and broad views about the resistance in Southeast Asia, especially from the view as reporter. In my sessions, I'm going to talk about understanding protests and movements of resistance. I must say that I'm very excited to share this topic with all of you here as an academic who have the background in the human rights. In the context of Southeast Asia, I must say the discourse, especially the academic discourse on social movements and resistance in Southeast Asia is rather limited if I look at it from the academic point of views. And from that perspective itself, I think it has impacted on the way that the reports are being written and so forth. So those are basically the ideas that I'm going to put forward here. But in my sessions, I'm going to take a step back, as in I will go to a more foundational perspective in terms of understanding the movements broadly, not only applicable in the context of Southeast Asia, but rather to understand it on the view from, I have divided my presentations into 4 parts. The first part is on the broad views and the concepts, different concepts that we use. Like just now, Zakia mentioned she preferred to use the word resistance. As we see from the reporting, different journalists from different countries, they use different terminologies. I see many journalists who cover on Myanmar, they like to use the word pro-democracy movement. So there are many different terms that we can use. Nevertheless, some of the terms can be different when we interpret it from the academic view. So my second part of my presentations will go into the theory, but of course I will not talk about this solely from the academic view, but the theories, the evolution of the social movement theory is very interesting, in which it actually tells us what are the elements that are being covered in the media and how this can actually generate new story ideas and so forth from the theoretical point of views. And my third part will be on the stages of social movements, because see, there's a lot of reporting that they normally started to report about the movements when the protests in the streets happen. But it is not way before, when there has been some grievances and things like that. But of course, from the other side, there are obstacles that the journalists face as well, and the resources and things like that. But however, social movement does have its own process and things. And my fourth, before I conclude, I will be providing just a very brief views about the media reporting, and of course talk about the biasness and so forth, and how it can actually impact on these social movements progress in the Southeast Asia. So from the very much historical perspectives here, on the global views, I did my thesis on the electoral reform movement, Bersih. So when I was doing my PhD on Bersih at that time, I must say that it has been rather challenging to find social movement scholars in the Southeast Asia. We do have, however, there are rather limited literatures that are being available. And hence, a lot of literatures are very much from the Western scholarships, where from the global point of views that there's the rise of the democratic representation, especially in the US and England in the late 70s, where the social movements are basically highly associated with democratic societies. Hence, when we put in the context of Southeast Asia, we know there are many countries who remains to be non-democratic, authoritarian, and so forth. So there has been a lot of discussions and debates on how do we then use the Western scholarship to be applied into the context of Southeast Asia alone. So however, the social movement studies evolved in the late 19th and the 20th centuries, whereby there has been more dynamic interaction between the democratic societies and the process of democratizations, and in authoritarian societies as well. So when we're talking about a lot of resistance movements that Zakia was mentioning just now, is all about the process of democratizations, even in the context of Malaysia as well. So my view here, and some scholars, is that social movements plays a huge part in terms of the process of democratizations. But we understand that from Malaysia and many other parts of Southeast Asia, protests or movements always being seen in a negative perception, as in something that is rather negative, but not looking at it from the view that it can actually contribute to the social and political change. So in the mid-1970s, there's a lot of research on collective actions coming from the emotional and psychological approach. So this is one part of the things that is missing in a lot of the reportings here, because a lot of reports focus on the political actors, the institutions, systems. Rather, in fact, when we talk about social movements and the resistance, there's a lot of elements coming from the emotions and the psychological approach, as in coming from the discipline of political psychology, to understand why do people protest, what are the factors that the movements actually occur, and what are the impacts. So those are the things from the global view. So from the regional perspective, of course, one of the main challenges that always come about is the heterogeneous identities and the diverse historical and geopolitical circumstances in Southeast Asia. I think this does not only put the challenges in terms of the academic literature, but it also put a lot of challenges when it comes to the reporting. So there are many reporting that focus only on country context. Rather, if we want to put it in a more regional context, it can become a little bit more challenging. So there is a need to actually look at many different elements that come about when we understand the social movements. So just now, Zaki has mentioned about some of the previous resistance struggles in different countries. I think late 1990s, we saw some of the fall of authoritarian regimes, and then of course the waves of Arab Spring and the Occupy Wall Streets basically renewed the developments from small-scale mobilizations to mass movements somehow in the academic literatures, and in terms of we can see more reporting on the protests and the movements as well. So it somehow becomes part of the political process and being normalized, because one of the factors is the emergence of the opposition forces and civil society. I think one of the countries that remains to be underreported is Cambodia, which is in one of the countries that requires a lot of media attention in examining what is really happens in Cambodia, apart from we are talking about Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries. So, so there are similar levels, but different styles of the state repression that I see from all the Southeast Asian countries. If we look at Singapore, it is at the different levels where it's a huge economic growth there. However, when we talk about democracy, there's really a lot of things that we want to talk about: resistance and the hindrances and the legislations as well. So moving forwards on the different concepts, I think there are many different concepts that we can use. Some we use social movement, but basically social movement refers to a loose network of the people who share the same grievances and engage into the collective actions. But there are also terminology that we call social movement organization. In fact, for per se, it is considered as an organization because it is being institutionalized. So however, of course, in the media, this term is hardly being used as well. So political movements, some that are more in pushing for political change. Protest movement is quite popularly being used as well, or resistance movements. Revolutionary movements basically refer to movements that attempt to overthrow a government. Civil disobedience is being used very frequently to describe Myanmar movements, civil disobedience movements, and civil resistance concept is basically refer to non-violent resistance. So I think there's these things between violent versus non-violent resistance that we talk about. So from the academic view, terminology, civil resistance basically refer to the non-violent. So for the civil society is another concept that many reportings are being used, but however, civil society is extremely broad. Civil society actors, sometimes it is being misused because it's basically send out different messages to people when you just put everything as civil society. So NGOs are part of it, where some they tend to use just NGOs to describe the movements, and then movements describe it as NGO. So there are many actually different terms that should be used and should be carefully being within as well. So I will just like to focus a little bit more about this social movement concept by Charles Tilly, a prominent scholar in the social movement studies, by focusing on the worthiness, unity, numbers, and the commitments that he used here. So very interestingly, the WUNC that Charles Tilly has been put forward is that those are the things that actually media has been reporting about. Nevertheless, it is not really being put together in a more comprehensive reporting, because sometimes I see the issues is that when we go for different commentators, they might have their own biasness. So when you go for politicians or political commentators, they might not look at movements from the movement point of view. They will always tie movement together with politics, but it's not everything should be politicized. There are more things to talk about the movement. So WUNC is very useful, whereby when we talk about worthiness, basically is referring to the component that is most directly related to how protesters actually behave while protesting. So worthiness here is really referring to the non-violent behaviors that the movements would like to show. There is no movements that actually, when we talk about social movements, that would like to engage into the violent approach first. So the second one is the unity. I think the unity component is always being put up by the media reporting, of course. So basically, unity refers to the agreement among the protesters. So unity does not actually deal with the substantive message the protester broadcast, but it deals with the extent to which how the media is shared among the participants. So for instance, the question of do they really have a common claim shared by all? So unity can most of the time not be observed directly. So it can occur in the head of the protester. So that's why very often we see protesters typically attempt to evoke their unity visually and behaviorally. So numbers, I think numbers is something that all the media are very familiar with. How many actually go down on the street, and how many likes or twitters or how many tweets and things like that. And we always know that the numbers can be very, very different. However, this is really, really challenging, actually. When you put up a number that doesn't really represent it really can impose a lot of impacts to the protesters. So the numbers is one thing that I think media should pay a little bit more careful in reporting when it comes to numbers. So, and then the commitment, of course, the appeal or threat generated by a movement really also depends on the degree of the commitment the protester display. But of course, movements relies on media a lot, and very often coming from the media lens, I know there are challenges that the media and the reporters that have to face. However, when the message of the movement is not being put up in a way that the goal is supposed to achieve, it can actually impact on that movement itself. For instance, if I take Bersih is only known as useful if they go down on the street, whereby their original goal is not go on the street, but people have associated with the image on the media that Bersih is yellow and it is street protest. So I believe that is a huge challenge imposed to Bersih in terms of, they actually wanted to do voters education. So those are the things that, however, it has been more than a decade that Bersih has been and has to suffer with that kind of image. So it actually put a lot of impacts on Bersih in terms of their sustainability. And another point that is not being pointed out by Tillis, but by other scholars, is about diversity. So when it comes to the diversities here, it's really applicable in the context of Southeast Asia, because sometimes when the media reporting also, we have to show, nowadays, I think a lot of medias put up the youth are part of the protest movements and things, but really, it is not really only the youth sometimes in some of the protests, but it is a mixture of the different groups as well. So sometimes the diversity itself is also very important to show and to create awareness about the certain forms of the protest. So social movements, I will move a little bit to the social movement theories here. Basically, what I have highlighted just now as well, that it is an interdisciplinary studies. Hence, the point I would like to really put up is that it is not just about political science, scientists looking at social movement, but really from the political psychology views as well and so forth, that I hope that this can reflect in the media reportings a little bit more in the context of Southeast Asia. So the evolution of social movement theory is very similar with what I have mentioned about. In fact, we talk about resources. Yeah, so we know some movements, they have existing resources, but some, I think a lot of movements in the context of Southeast Asia, they do not have much resources. And one of the resources is actually media. Media is everywhere, and media is extremely powerful when we talk about movements, about they can either they can really impact heavily on the movements and how it is being progressed, whether it can actually achieve the goals or it doesn't. So the political process theory is the one that I'm going to focus here, and this is the theories that I use in describing the developments and the formations of the BERSI here. So resource mobilizations theory basically is not something that most of the movements in Southeast Asia has, because it not only refer to the financial resources, but of course it also focuses on the media resources and so forth as well. And the media, as we know, the challenges in the context of Southeast Asia, where some are state-owned, some are party-owned, and some can be not independent. So those are the things that most of the movements in Southeast Asia do not have the luxury with. That is to have a more independent reporting about their goals. So, but resource mobilizations theory basically telling that the actions of the members and participants are rational. I think this is one of the challenge that, you know, when of course media doing the reporting, it is in a way that it is a platform to create awareness as well. So very often public see participants are irrational, but from the social movement studies view, the participants and the protesters are all being recognized as rational actors. But of course, it can open up to a little bit more debates. So political process theory is basically looking at how the external opportunities can actually help the movements to grow. So this is one of the things that a lot of reporting are actually focusing on that. However, what I would really like to show is here. The political opportunity structures derived from the political process theory from Doug McAdam, in which he divided into this theory into 4. So if you look at popular access to the political system, division within the elite, the availability of allies, and the state repression, all of these somehow have been regularly being reported by the media in the different reportings, taking pieces by pieces. You know, I think one of the things that being very often being reported is the elements on the state repression. So we know state repression can affect the mobilization, whereby mobilization is one of the key things that social movements have to survive on, how they can mobilize the people. The availability of allies, look into different allies. One of the allies is a political party. Another allies can be media. So I will skip the media as we already know, but political parties, this is where it becomes issues in some of the countries, because if a movement is close to the opposition political party, which most of the time in the context of Southeast Asia share the same grievances, then they will be talking about, you know, the movements are no longer independent. But from the social movement studies point of view, that is totally accepted up to the different political context. Because if we look at the past histories, a lot of independence movement, resistance movement actually turn into political parties. So those are the things that I think in the more public discourse has been missing out. Popular access to the political systems, of course, refer to the movements do not have the regular access to the political powers. Hence, we have the social movements. So I think sometimes the media also reporting on this. However, it's not really being that in-depth. And the divisions within the elites basically refers to the fragmentations that happen with the political elites, either some of the high-profile politicians or some of the different class, privileged classes of the people or middle class, upper class that actually join into the movements that can actually provide opportunities to the movements to grow. So basically the POS, political opportunity structures, can constrain or expand the collective action in many, many ways. I think I would just like to want to focus is that they can actually create opportunities for the opponents. I think in the case of Malaysia, we see the red shirt. So when you have a lot of media reporting on the Bersih, in one point, I mean, from the social movement studies point of view, it shows that Bersih movement had successfully actually penetrate into the society. Hence, you have the backfire. Hence, you have the counter movements like red shirt. So, of course, opportunities like this can be used in both ways. My third part of it, stages of movement. So very often, a lot of reporting happens in the second stage on the coalescence stage, in which when the movements are already managed to actually gather a lot of discontent or frustrations coming from the different populations, and the leadership has emerged somehow, and the strategies of success are being mapping out. So in the emergence is basically just a widespread discontent. So there are many reportings, of course, to say that, you know, there have been people not happy with the economic policies in the countries and so forth. However, I think what is really lacking is perhaps more reportings that can a follow-up reporting to the discontent or grievances that happens in their countries. So to follow the story a little bit and provide a more comprehensive reporting. So on the stage 3 of the reporting is basically bureaucratized, is the institutionalizations of the social movements, whereby it is being characterized by the high levels of organizations and the coalition-based strategies. I think coalition-based strategies is something that Bersih is doing, and it comes about from the limited resources that most of the movements have. And at the stage where they are bureaucratizing, they can no longer just rely on the mass rallies or any leaders to progress towards their goals. So those are the moving to the third stage. And the fourth stage, decline. Decline stage can be divided into 5 different phases. So success means that, you know, the movement basically has managed to achieve the goals. Failure normally happens when they are faced with a lot of state repression, very high state repression. Co-optations happen where some organizations or movements can be highly dependent on centralized authority or charismatic leadership. So when the movement leaders come to associate with the authorities, the leader could be, you know, being co-opted into the systems, and that can contribute to the decline of the movement itself. And another one is the repressions, whereby the authorities or the agents acting on behalf of the authorities use the measures, sometimes violent, to actually control or destroy a movement. And the last one, go mainstream, basically meaning that the goals or ideologies are adopted by the mainstream, in which this is hardly happened in the context of Southeast Asia. But this is basically the stages of social movements that I would like to share. And now I go to my very last part and the concluding quickly. And mediating message, of course, just now I mentioned media is really, really important when we talk about social movements. So activists, of course, they need the media to convey message to wider audiences. However, we are always talking about these framing issues, how the media frame that movements, ideas, ideologies, and the goals are very, very important, as it can directly impact on the process of developments of that particular social movement itself. So media coverage can help marginalized actors set a social and political agenda, but how often does it help? And I think in some of the instances, it can actually create some backfire as well, depending on how the media is reporting on that. But basically, if we put it in the lens of the activist movement, must frame injustice to convince as wide an audience as possible that the problem exists and the collective efforts at redress are efficacious. So the biasness in reporting, I think, is something that the journalists face dilemma with. There are different types of biasness. One, selective selection bias, which protests get covered. Most of the protests that get covered are the big protests. There are many protests, or protests. When I say protest, it doesn't mean on the street protest, but many movements are not being covered, unfortunately. Yeah, depending on the issues. So nowadays, a lot of things are talking about environment, climate change. So most of the focus are all gone to anything to do with environment. So other kind of movements that fight for other rights can be actually marginalized in such a way. So those are the things that can impact on the movement. Description bias, how is protest being described, is extremely important, and it can actually kill a movement itself by putting the different narratives on that movement. So explaining biasness, of course, this is basically focusing on organizational factors, structural factors, and ideological factors. I think this is very common dilemma for many journalists here, that one thing is that journalists can be generalists as well, because you can't expect a journalist must be trained in the social movement studies to cover on a social on a movements. So that takes a lot of research and so forth. But sometimes that can actually impact on how the reporting is being done, and can impact on the development of the movements. Structural factors, this is something that a lot of medias are facing, advertising avenues, and what kind of report that you should do and things like that. Ideological factors, and sometimes perhaps the personal bias coming from the journalist can also impact on how the movement is being framed in the media as well. So in the conclusion, I would just like to put up a few ideas and suggestions here. I think interdisciplinary reporting is really important, as in looking at movements from a different lens, not only always start out with the state actors, but perhaps I know there's a lot of stories and the narratives that looking at the protesters, but sometimes it is very much selective, only on the several phases. So I think those are the things. Changes in public policy, that means to tie the movements with the changes in the public policy. That means any form of political change, for instance, Bersih and electoral reforms. So those are some of the things that have been being reported quite successfully in a way. Yeah? Social movements and democratizations. So this is basically even in globally, there have been growing literatures in terms of linking movements and the democratizations, because democratization is a process where there's a lot of focus on the state actors. There's little focus on movements, or even in a broader way, the civil society, how they can contribute to the process of democratization. So this is the one of the things that I would like to put up here. And my final point is that protest is not all just marching in the street, but protest can be many, many other forms as well. I say this because this is the very first challenge that I faced when I introduced the course on social movements and democratization in the University of Malaya. My first class of the students, basically, they think, is she going to teach me about how to go to the street to protest when they see the word movements? So there's a lot of negative perceptions in terms of protest. So protest can be in any form. It doesn't need to be just on the street. So, and that tied up with how we view the concept of movements and the resistance as well. Thank you very much.